I'm very pleased to welcome Mike Brewer today, who's going to be talking about, after COVID-19, what have we learned about the UK's labour market, inequality and the welfare system. So we're going to learn a lot today. It's going to, I think, be drawing on a range of research that is examining the role of COVID-19 in shedding light on inequalities, the operation of the social security system and vulnerability in the labour market. At least that's what I'm anticipating. So Mike Brewer is Deputy Chief Executive at the Resolution Foundation and is visiting professor here in the Department of Social Policy. He is an economist by training and has had a varied career inside and outside academia, bringing his expertise to bear on issues of social policy and in particular the UK labour market, income inequalities, poverty and welfare policies. He has, for example, conducted research on working families tax credit and universal credit, on lone parent work obligations, changes in income inequality, income volatility, the minimum wage and anti-poverty strategies. Before he moved to the Resolution Foundation, Mike was Professor of Economics at the University of Essex for 9 years, where he directed the ESRC Research Centre for Micro-Social Change. And he directed that for 8 years, 8 of those 9 years. And before Essex, he was at the IFS for 10 years, and he directed the tax and welfare section there. So in 2020, he moved to his current role at the Resolution Foundation, which is an independent think tank focused on improving the living standards of those on low to middle incomes. In that role, he's responsible for the Foundation's research programme and for 20 researchers working across a wide range of UK economic and social policy issues. As you may have become aware, the Resolution Foundation made key contributions during the COVID-19 crisis, both to policy, including the design of the job retention scheme, and to understanding the impact of COVID on the labour market, on household finances, and on the distribution of income and wealth. So Mike is particularly well placed to talk about this topic. So I'm really looking forward to it, and I'm going to hand over. So Mike, you have about 45 minutes ideally, and then we'll move to questions after that. Thank you very much.
Sounds great. Thank you very much, Lucinda. Welcome to you all. Pleased to do my first official bit of business with the department. Sorry, I couldn't make your welcome drinks a couple of weeks ago. This is not going to be a presentation of a particular paper. It is going to draw on several things that my colleagues at Resolution Foundation have done over the last 18 years. I may also not answer all of the questions I pose in the title, but hopefully in the discussion we can begin to get some answers to those too, when you've seen the facts that I brought to the debate. Okay, so roughly in three thirds, I'll tell you a bit about the labour market, drawing on the latest statistics from a couple of days ago, talk a bit about what we learned about how distribution of income and wealth has changed, and then a little bit about how the welfare system coped and what we might take for the future. The big picture, the economic big picture to all of this talk, of course, is that this is an extremely unusual crisis with very, very large swings in GDP, economic output, which mostly, thanks mostly to government policies, were hardly seen at all in the labour market or in household incomes. GDP loss of 10% last year, leading to just a tiny change in employment and a tiny change in disposable income. Of course, within that, there were many people who did suffer losses, as we'll come on to with this talk, but the big picture is completely different from all previous economic crises, and we should just bear that in mind as we go through the talk. So where are we right now? This is data from Tuesday, going up to show for the labour force survey, so the latest data from the labour force survey, just looking at what has happened, the evolution of employment, unemployment, and inactivity through the crisis. The solid lines are the 3-month series, and then the kind of dashed and grey lines are the more volatile series. What you can see is employment rates fell during 2020, but have been on the up since the beginning of this year. Unemployment did the reverse, went up during 2021, peaked around the start of this year, has been falling since. And inactivity is doing something a little bit different, has been really rising, essentially been rising constantly since the crisis started. That's the big picture. Now I'm going to zoom out and show you how all of those changes compare to historical trends in those three series, but I can't fit that on one graph. So you're going to see three graphs coming up, one for employment, one for unemployment, one for inactivity. And the big picture for all of them, though, is going to be that the changes we've seen in the crisis are really very small indeed compared to even just recent history. So this is unemployment. Back to 2006, where you can see that the rise in unemployment last year just took us back to where we were really in 2016. And we've got unemployment rates that are nothing like as high as they were in the aftermath of the financial crisis. For employment, again, the fallback that we saw in 2020 just sort of takes us back a few years, really, back to about 2016, 2017 levels. The drop in employment is quite large, just a little bit smaller than we saw in the financial crisis, but the levels are still incredibly high, and the rebound has happened much sooner than happened after the financial crisis. And then lastly, inactivity. Again, the rise in activity we've seen just takes us back maybe only a couple of years to 2017 was the last time we had inactivity this high. A little bit differently here, though, is the rise in activity from the trough in 2020 to early this year. That rise has been a little. Can you see the mouse wandering around? I can't remember if I'm sharing my. Yes, you can. Okay, fine. The rise in activity there is a little bit greater than the rise in activity that happened at the onset of the financial crisis. So these are all really small changes, right, in the grand scheme of things in the labour market, to the aggregate things in the labour market. There was the other thing that people have been focused on recently is what would happen as the furlough scheme, the job retention scheme, came to an end. This graph is showing the fraction of workers who were on the job retention scheme, who were furloughed by age throughout the months of 2021. And what we've seen in 2021, as the previous graphs highlight, is the labour market getting stronger and stronger and stronger as we go back to normal. And you can see that in the so the story we told when the pandemic hit, that this was a pandemic hitting younger workers and older workers, has just become less and less, has become false. It's not true anymore. In February, you could see that the fraction of workers on furlough was highest amongst younger workers and also older workers. Probably we should ignore the under 18s, they're quite a select group, but even if we focus on the 18-24s, their rates of furlough in February and March were higher than other age groups. And as this year went on, as the economy opened up, their furlough rates have fallen by much more than those of older workers, until the final line, the purple line for September at the bottom, has an upward sloping age profile, with older workers more likely to be on furlough as the scheme ended than younger workers. And so partly because of that, but because we know that older workers are a little bit slower to find new work than younger workers, partly because we could see that the workers who were left on furlough at the end were working in the sort of sectors which you wouldn't have thought were particularly affected by coronavirus. And many people were worried that the ending of the job retention scheme at the end of September would cause a spike in unemployment or rise in redundancies. And that turned out not really to be the case. I've forgotten which order my slides come in. Right here. So work we published at the weekend, based on a quick survey we did at the start of October. Sorry, this is one great big slide showing you one important number, but we estimated, based on a fairly small sample of furloughed workers, that about 88% of those who were furloughed in September were working in October, not necessarily for the same employer, but they had a job, and the other 12% were not in work. So this is much higher than people had feared as we came towards the end of, as we're going into the summer and saw the end of furlough coming up. I have two reasons why this is higher than you might have expected. The first one, which our survey shed some light on, is that 15% of people who were on furlough in September had already found another job which they were working in. So they were multitasking, which was perfectly legal in the job retention scheme. You could be furloughed by employer A and then go and do some work for employer B at the same time. So 1 in 6 had already found another job, and then half were partially furloughed. So they were doing some work for their employer. And when we look in detail at what happened, basically almost all those who were partially furloughed just have carried on working in October. Any job losses or redundancies were amongst those who were fully furloughed, but about half, which is about half of those who were on furlough in September. Anyway, so that's a good news story. That's part of the good news story. Well, I guess, sorry, we won't know for sure what's happened to the 1 million workers on furlough, for a while yet. I guess HMRC will know that through their admin data. This result's based on a fairly small survey sample. We might learn more from other surveys. What we can see in the aggregate data based on Tuesday's release was this data, which comes from HMRC's Revenue Customs Administrative data, which shows that in October, inflows to employment were higher than they have been for many years yet. Another sign of this very healthy and active labour market. And yes, there is a small tick up in outflows, but not one that is consistent with 1 million people on furlough or losing their job. So that lends some support to the idea that the ending of the furlough scheme has been fairly benign for the labour market as a whole. This is looking at the same administrative data, just showing the change in the number of jobs by sector. In October, we're now in a position where there are more employee jobs than there were pre-pandemic. The sectors most affected by coronavirus, retail, hospitality and leisure, are still below their pre-pandemic levels. Indeed, some of those would have been on long-term decline anyway, such as retail. Other sectors are employing many more people than they were pre-pandemic, such as health and social care. So that's another glimpse that the labour market is doing well at the moment. Okay, but now I want to return to spend a few slides talking about one of the points I made earlier, which was the rise in inactivity, or the flip side of this slide, the decline of labour force participation. And although I did say that the rise in economic inactivity in the last couple of years, is still small to what we've seen over the last decade or so. It's been on a gradual decline over the last decade, and the last year has just seen a small blip up compared to that. What we're doing in this chart is comparing what has happened in this recession to the previous 3 economic crises in the UK. As far as employment goes, on the right-hand side, the decline in employment rates in this after COVID were initially just as bad as the recession of the 1980s. But since then, as we've seen, the economy has recovered and employment is picking up again. And such that the COVID crisis looks less bad for employment than the previous 3 crises. For participation, on the left-hand side, labour force participation, that is less the case. We're doing sort of as badly as the 1990s recession and worse than the financial crisis or the 1980s recession. If we are to look in detail at who has reduced the labour force participation, so the result of COVID is on the left. Obviously, must emphasise in the grand scheme of things, these are still fairly small changes, but the fall in labour force participation has come mostly from younger people and older people. If we, at the bottom, you can see the breakdown between men and women and those with and without children, and in fact, women with children under 19 in the house have increased their labour force participation. Those without children have also seen a small increase. Men have, most of the decline is coming from men on average. So that's all, and then on the right hand side is how that compares to the financial crisis. Obviously, young people, we know that one impact of the financial crisis was to send young people into education, which is why young people's labour force participation fell so much after the financial crisis. But you can also see the financial crisis led to an increase in labour force participation amongst those aged 25 and over, particularly amongst those aged 55 and over, and that is not seen at all during the COVID, in the aftermath of the COVID crisis. Let me just go in a bit more detail on those changes. So here I'm going to focus on not the whole age range, but just focus on 25 to 60-year-olds. And here I'm looking at labour force participation rates of men and women in 2019 and 2021. You can see on the left some of that decline in participation for men, and it's young men too. It's not just the older men, although older men have seen that participation fall too. So we've got some declines going on here and here. And then for women, increases in labour force participation for young women, but also for women in their 30s. What this graph is hiding is the fall in participation amongst workers aged 60 or more. I've just left them off the graph just because it involves, if I did include them, it would involve extending the y-axis down a lot, and you might miss some of these changes at younger ages. I've also left off the under 25s for similar reasons. So yes, but the point here is it's not a uniform decline in labour force participation. There are definitely some groups which have increased labour force participation during the crisis and others which have reduced it. So going back to older workers again, as I think that could be an area of concern, and again doing that thing where we compare COVID crisis to the previous 3 crises. Here I'm looking at men over 50, in their 50s. Yeah, men in their 50s, to try and ignore any issues to do with retirement and the state pension age. I'm just showing how employment rates, inactivity rates, and unemployment rates changed in the 4 years after the onset of the last few crises. Yeah.
I just sort of briefly interrupt. So it's quite hard to see your all of your lines. So if you could use my mouse to highlight the
of course,
the COVID lines that we can't see very well, then that would be helpful. Because I can see the 80s and 90s well, but not the other ones.
Oh, so it's the colour, is it not? The colour's not coming out very well. Okay.
And light blue is not very good either.
Yeah.
So.
Oh.
So if you can just sort of guide us where we should be looking, that'd be really helpful.
Yes, of course. Well, the big picture for this one is that the COVID outcomes for men are not that different from previous crises. Let me try and talk you through that. On employment, you can see the red and blue lines. So employment for men did fall rapidly and then after the 1980s, 90s recession, and COVID is basically tracking that at the moment. With the blue, wrong line. With the blue line, financial crisis being the financial crisis is where older men didn't suffer quite so much. But inactivity, the yellow line is tracking the dark blue line. So again, the inactivity rate for older men is changing at about the same rate as it did in the 1990s. Again, that's worse than the financial crisis, which is actually below the axis. So participation for old men rose after the financial crisis. And unemployment, you can see the red and blue line. The yellow line is tracking the dark blue line, at least until the last few data points. But the point here is relatively similar experiences for older men than previous crises. Where it's different is for women. It's quite hard to narrate this, what you can see. So focusing on employment rates, women's employment rates fell in the 1980s. That's the red line. They actually rose slightly after the 1990s recession. That's the dark blue line. And they rose slightly after the financial crisis. That is a light blue line here. What we've seen under COVID is much larger falls in employment for older women. The line is kind of going down there. It's below the red line. Inactivity, middle bar, it's the same picture. The inactivity rates almost didn't rise at all for older women in the previous 3 crises, but in the COVID crisis, they have risen. And on the right-hand side is unemployment, where the story is more of similarity. So the differences are in the employment and inactivity. So employment is falling for older women, inactivity is rising for older women, and that's not really been the case. It wasn't the case in the previous 3 financial crises. Definitely good to have a discussion at the end about what's going on. With some of these data points only coming out 2 days ago, I don't have all the answers, but my summary of what's going on on inactivity, and inactivity, the reason I'm focusing on inactivity, I really think this is the thing to watch over the next, next few quarters and years. So young people have reduced their labour market participation. Part of that is they're more likely to have enrolled in full-time education. That tends to happen in recessions. It's happened in this one too. But an extra thing is at the moment, young people have been less likely to work at the same time as they are in full-time education. So students have been just students rather than students with jobs on the side. That is probably due to the fact that students tend to work in sectors that have been heavily hit by COVID, or maybe they don't want to, and that may well recover. Mothers, oh, I didn't say earlier, we have a paper, a lot of the slides I'm showing you are due to come out in a paper coming out on Tuesday. And in that, we will go into more detail looking at the rise in labour force participation amongst mothers, where we're going to show some evidence of an added worker effect. In other words, that mothers are increasing their labour force participation to make up for the fact that their partners were furloughed or lost their job or saw their hours cut. And we see some evidence of that remote or hybrid working is helping some mothers work. Neither of those two don't explain everything, but they do explain some of the small changes we've seen. And then, but older people is things where we should be more worried, because we know from the 1980s, so we know from that when older people do move out of the labour market, in their 50s, they can sometimes find it hard to go back. We know that when older people are displaced and they do go back at reduced hours and on reduced wages compared to younger workers. So if here I think there is a risk that COVID could lead to a permanent shock, the COVID shock could lead to a permanent loss in income amongst some older people. Not yet clear whether how much of that is due to health issues or health concerns. Good to discuss that. I might skip a couple of slides. I'll do geography quickly. I'll skip some slides later. On geography, I think what's well known is that London is the standout region, seeing the biggest negative labour market shock and being the slowest to recover. This is not quite the absolute latest data, but this chart is showing the percentage change in employees, showing the peak is in the border, and the coloured in pink bit is the situation in July. Sorry, it's a couple of months out of date now. So I think that's widely known. What's maybe a bit less well known is that even within these regions, there's a reasonably strong correlation between levels of pay in an area and by how much their number of employees has fallen. So the higher paid areas have seen bigger falls in employment. The purple dots are London boroughs, and we were a bit worried that effect was driven by London. The red dots are not London boroughs, and the red line just shows the line of best fit excluding London. So it's still the case. It's still the case that higher paid parts of the country have seen or are seeing bigger falls in employment than lower paid areas. And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know what's going on. The hypothesis would be that it is due to the reduced spending on hospitality and leisure, which is a more important part of the local economy in high paid areas than in low paid areas. Okay, that's labour market. I have not as much to say on the second 2/3 of my talk, so I think we're on track. And I wanted to give a summary of what we found on how incomes, spending, and particularly wealth have changed during the pandemic. Actually, I'm not going to show you a slide on income, but we were tracking how family income had changed through the pandemic, and the bottom line is that the overall changes track quite well the health of the labour market. So when we did our latest snapshot back in June, you couldn't see much difference between levels of incomes in June 2021 and pre-pandemic levels of income, broadly replicating the state of the labour markets. Of course, that is an average, and within that there's lots of heterogeneity. So I've left that slide out. Household incomes, in the summer were, say on average, basically back to where they were pre-pandemic. I want to focus on what's driving some of the longer term changes, which I think comes from spending, then into savings, debt, and wealth. So this is a chart which is showing where we asked people how their spending had changed in June compared to pre-pandemic levels. I've sorted people according to their household income, put them into quintiles, and the red bars represent people who are telling us their spending was lower than it was pre-pandemic, and the green bars are people who are telling us their spending was higher. The pattern to take away is that reporting that you were spending less is more common amongst the highest income people than it was the lower income people. the same chart measured earlier in the pandemic showed a much stronger gradient. And the reason for the gradient is that higher income people spend more of their money on discretionary items of spending, including hospitality, leisure, tourism, and so on. And so they have the most scope to, so when spending on those, when those parts of the economy were shut down, it has a bigger impact on the spending of higher income people than lower income people. That, yeah, by June, we were of course partially opened up, but that impact could still be seen. So with incomes sort of back to normal by June, but spending still showing this skewed pattern of changes, that has implications for, oh, sorry, one more slide to come. Within that, an important wrinkle is not really how it varies by age, but how it varies according to whether or not you have children in the household. So those here, I've just split you also according to whether you have children or not. I've also rotated it, so you know, I've got a column graph, but the red bars at the bottom are people who are reporting that their spending had increased, and it's much more common amongst those with children than it is amongst those without children. And that was my cue, I think, yes, to go back to some of the mixed methods work I did at the end of last year with Patrick from the University of York, where we were looking precisely at why families with children might have been spending more during the pandemic. Our work was focused on the periods of full lockdown, particularly the start of the one in 2020, but also some of the lockdowns in late 2020. And here is one. I won't read it out, but here is Nellie telling us about why her spending went up during the pandemic. I think a really interesting point is it's not just that there are greater needs placed on her. It's also that some of the things she would have done that were free, she talks about she would have gone to a library or a charity shop as ways of entertaining her children cheaply or for free, were not available to her, and so she ended up having to spend more money elsewhere. And then another participant was telling us about how the move to homeschooling put much more costs on him and his family, and basically doing any form of homeschooling in the first lockdown required a laptop and a solid internet connection. But going back to the income, spending, and debt story. So yes, by June this year, incomes hadn't changed that much across the income distribution, but we still see this pattern of spending changes, which is skewed by income. The result of those two things is that saving and debt are going to change in ways that are skewed by income. So here we're asking people about how their saving, their regular saving, how that has changed compared to before the pandemic. Green bars are people saying, I'm saving more, and red bars are people saying, I'm saving yes. And you can see very clearly the distributional skew to that. High income people are more likely to say they are saving more. The converse is that lower income families are more likely to tell us that they are more indebted in June, in the summer, than they were pre-pandemic. We split that down between those who are newly indebted and have seen debts increase. Of course, yes, in aggregate over this period, we know that the saving rate has been much higher and debts have been paid off in aggregate. Again, there's that split between those with and without children. Those with children on the left-hand side being more likely to tell us that their debts had gone up during the pandemic for those without. Okay, and then in one of my favorite pieces of work that I've ever done this year in our wealth audit, we put those survey results together a lot and combined them with information from the Wealth and Assets Survey and quite a lot of modeling jiggery-pokery to try and say, well, what's happened to distribution of wealth during the pandemic? So these are what I'm going to show you now are partly estimates, partly simulations. They're not real data. There's real data somewhere underlying it, but these figures come from a modeling exercise. So this is what we think has happened to family wealth per adult for people in different income deciles as a result of those active changes in saving and debt. So I'm not yet thinking about capital gains. This is just what changes happen because people have been able to save more at the top, or they've been able to pay down their debts, or their debt has gone up. The blue bars show the absolute changes and the red bars show the percentage. So these active changes in wealth are skewed towards better off households, higher income households, which is as you would expect, given what's happened to spending patterns. But then the kind of key points of that work, and so here you just got to remember what the scale of the axis is. So for the top decile, that's a change of £3,000. We then looked at the passive changes in wealth, so those changes in wealth caused by basically by capital gains. Very unusually for crises, the UK has seen house prices rocket since the pandemic started. House prices should fall during recessions. That's what all economists will tell you. They haven't done in this one. And although the FTSE is down in this country compared to pre-pandemic levels, global stock markets are still up compared to significantly up compared to pre-pandemic levels. So all those things are great news if you own a house or if you have a pension. And what we did in the modelling was try and assess how what those passive changes in wealth mean. The blue bars show you the absolute amounts, obviously very, very skewed to higher income households and much bigger in magnitude than the changes due to active changes in savings and debt. The red bar is the proportional change. And several times when writing the wealth audit, we're basically trying to think, well, should we care about absolute inequality in wealth, or should we care about relative inequality in wealth? If you care about relative inequality in wealth, then you might look at the gains from deciles 4 to 10 and think, well, that means that the bottom, the fourth decile is catching up with the top decile because it's seeing a higher rate of growth in its assets. But I just think that is tending towards well, not meaningless, but I do think it's important to look also at the absolute gaps between low wealth and high wealth people, as I think, and they've clearly grown. Anyway, that was just passive changes. Put them both together, and you get not much difference. So this is what we think has happened to levels of family wealth per adult sorted by income decile as a result of the pandemic. You can decide whether you want to focus on the change in relative inequalities as shown by the red line, or changes in absolute gaps as shown by the blue line. That was done according to income deciles. Now let's switch to wealth deciles. So same kind of calculation, but what has the pandemic done to, well, this is the absolute gap between levels of wealth in each decile of wealth distribution compared to the fifth decile of wealth distribution. And the answer is they continue to push up the absolute gaps between the top and the fifth decile. And finally, one more on wealth inequality is we looked at how that had changed the age distribution of wealth. So the solid bars show the absolute changes in wealth for people of different ages through the pandemic. The line shows you what that has done to in percentage terms. Again, you need to decide whether you care about relative gaps in wealth between those different ages or absolute gaps in wealth between those different ages, because the blue line tells you that younger people in their 30s and 40s saw a higher percentage increase in their wealth than did those in their 50s and 60s. But because those in their 60s and 70s have just much more wealth to start with, those smaller percentage gains still end up being larger absolute gains. But I think that is one of the big, this could well be one of the big changes in inequality that we'll see coming out of the pandemic, is what it's done to intergenerational differences in wealth. Very happy to come back to that in discussion. And then the last bit, I'll just talk about what the welfare system has gone through and what lessons we might draw from that. The first lesson is that the pandemic showed us how important it is to have a social security system that is good at doing income replacement. And the UK system is not very good at doing income replacement. So complicated graph, but it's showing you, I hope the colors work. I'm plotting, well, we worked out what our replacement rates. So we did a calculation that worked out if you lost your job and you claim welfare benefits, if you're entitled to them, then how much income would your family have compared to what it had before you lost your job? And we do that in a large household survey, so we can make it representative. And the pre-pandemic answer is that at the median, you would be on 50% of your previous income. That's the kind of the black dot at the very bottom. So across all employees, or rather, if a random employee lost their job, then the median fall in income would be a half. You'd go from 100% to 50%. Okay. Look at that split by your earnings decile, then the UK's flat rate social security system provides more earnings replacement to lower earners than higher earners, such that the median replacement rate, if you're in the top earnings decile, is just below 30%. Now, these actually might be higher than you're expecting, and that's because we are thinking that when we did the calculations about replacement rates, we're thinking about the entire income of a family. So for couples, we are also factoring in the fact that your partner might have a job, might have an income. Anyway, so that's what we had pre-pandemic. And if the government had just let the pandemic hit and not introduced any of its additional support measures, then that is the sort of those black dots with the green bars denoting some variation around them. Those black dots denote the sort of income falls that people would have experienced, and they would have led to severe hardship, severe and widespread hardship. And so the government did allow that to happen, and it introduced a job retention scheme. And what we show in the yellow dots, which you might not be able to see, but the purple bars around them, but the yellow dots show the median replacement rate in each earnings decile for somebody who was furloughed, put on the job retention scheme, furloughed, and got 80% of their previous earnings. And for such people, the average replacement rate, it's higher than 80%, it's just over 90%, it's given by the bottom row. And the reason it's higher than 90% is because of the additional people in the family who might also be bringing in some income. And it's also due to the benefit system, which will top up your income at the bottom. So thanks to the job retention scheme, most people who were negatively affected in the first stage of the pandemic were not subject to the black dots. They were instead subject to income losses described by the yellow dots. And I think the one really big question for us now is, although we have gone back to the black dots, we have gone back to the old social security system, we do need to ask ourselves whether it would be sensible for the UK to have more insurance built into its social security system. Same is also true for statutory sick pay, which is the other way in which the welfare state has been insuring us against shocks a lot the last 18 months. In the UK, you are not eligible for statutory sick pay at all if you earn less than £120 a week. And this chart just shows you what fraction of employees do indeed earn less than £120 a week in pre-pandemic data. And I think one of the most scary, we did this work in 2020, whilst the coronavirus was rampaging around, and the really scary point for me was that 16%, 1 in 6 people who worked in customer-facing sectors were not eligible for any statutory sick pay. Precisely the kind of people who you would want to feel able to stay at home and self-isolate if they were to catch a contagious virus were not eligible for any statutory sick pay. So I think what the pandemic has shown us, hopefully what the pandemic has done is it has elevated discussions around statutory sick pay from being it's reminded us that statutory sick pay is not just a part of our social security system, it's also part of our public health policy. And you could probably characterize our previous approach to statutory sick pay as running it down, residualizing it, transferring all responsibilities to employers, and also trying to devise a system that sort of places some of the burden on individuals. And I think the question we need to ask now is that, well, does that might work as a sort of cut price rudimentary bare safety net, but it's not the good policy to have when you're dealing with a contagious disease. So those are two lessons I think we might need to learn. I just got a few more slides on the most recent social security changes, focusing on universal credit. As you probably know, universal credit was boosted when the pandemic hit, with the main rates of universal credit going up by £20 a week. And this was, government always said this was going to be temporary. It extended it a couple of times, but finally at the end of September, the £20 a week did finally expire. And then a few weeks later, in the autumn budget, at the end of October, the government announced some tweaks to universal credit, which offset some of that. So what they actually did was reduce the taper rate, which determines how quickly universal credit is withdrawn from you as your earnings rise. And so by reducing the taper rate, they mean you can keep more of your universal credit if you have earnings. And also which also means it extends further up the incomes and earnings distribution. Anyway, so this chart shows the overall impact of those two changes together amongst universal credit recipients. The dark blue bar showed people who are, sorry, the dark blue bar is about the, I can't remember the numbers, but the majority of universal credit claimants are not working. And if you're not working, then you gain nothing from the budget change and you lose out from £20. So you're definitely going to be a loser. The red bars are people who lost out on £20. They gained a bit from the taper cut, but not enough to offset £20. Green bars are people who gain more from the taper cut than they lost from £20 a week. And the shaded bars are people who are newly entitled to universal credit for the first time. And the numbers I couldn't remember were the size of those three groups, but you can you can see that the blue are the largest group. I've forgotten the numbers in millions. We looked at what that meant for poverty rates. Actually, the impact the overall impact on poverty from these two changes, so cutting £20 and then putting money back in through a lower taper rate, the overall impact of that is to increase poverty slightly. Actually, the impact is not as marked as you might have thought, given the sums of money involved. That is because the giveaway, the cut in the taper rate, is quite well targeted on people who are around the poverty line. If I'd shown you the impact on poverty gap, then I think the outcome would look quite a lot worse for the recent changes. What does this mean for the future? I mean, I think it's probably too soon to say that we know what the government's strategy is towards universal credit. So it's welcome that the government is thinking and talking about how to structure welfare in the UK, what to do about universal credits. And the Chancellor had a principled statement behind his changes. He said he wanted people to keep more of their earnings when their earnings rose. Right, and one way to do that is to reduce the taper, and that's what he did. But the implication of cutting the taper is that universal credit, as I said, extends further up the earnings distribution. So here, the two lines to look at are the dark blue and dark green. I hope you can see those. So the dark blue line is the universal credit schedule for a family with 2 children before the crisis hit, so without £20 a week. And then the green line is the universal credit schedule after the taper cut. And because we are now withdrawing it more slowly, as your earnings rise, it goes further up the earnings distribution. The red line, though, shows you what the situation was like in 2010 under the old tax credit system. And just before, we had a whole series of reforms introduced by George Osborne when he was Chancellor, which were partly to save money, but one of the principles behind his reforms was that we shouldn't pay welfare benefits to people who are on decent earnings levels. And I'm not sure whether the recent changes to universal credit mean that the Conservative Party no longer think that, but it's certainly very, very striking how much we've moved back towards the red line. Having said that, of course, the budget changes were only help people in universal credit if they were in work. If you were out of work, then the only change you've seen is losing that £20 a week. And this chart just shows that means that the basic level of unemployment benefit or any of our safety net benefits, if you haven't got children, are at the lowest levels they've been since 1991 in real terms, is the blue line, and against average earnings is the red line. They've never been lower. And I think I'll leave it there. Big conclusion is I've of course given you a talk through perhaps the economic implications of the crisis and the impact on economic inequalities. I've not said anything about health impacts, and you could certainly tell a different story if you were to focus on how the health impacts of the virus overlapped with the economic impacts of the virus, which overlapped with housing deprivation and so on. I think there's an extremely powerful story to be told there, which I have not touched on. So my conclusions are, where are we with the labour market? It's broadly recovered on average, albeit we're about to see real wages falling as with inflation going up. Long-term impacts, which we can discuss. How much working from home will there be? Well, actually, I've held back my slides in order for there to be something new in the paper we're releasing next week, but we could certainly discuss what you think might be going on. There could be a long-term impact through early retirement, as I was showing you, through older people stepping back out of the labour market. And it's yet to be seen what is the impact on those young people who did suffer time out of work in the last year and a half, or indeed those young people who've suffered a mental health shock in the last year, which might well then have knock-on impacts for their labour market participation in years to come. I think that's one big set of unknowns. I've showed you the impact on household income. Well, as I told you, the impact on household incomes has broadly recovered in line with the labour market, but their permanent impact has come about through changes in spending patterns and ended up in wealth. And I think it remains to be seen what are the implications of those extended wealth gaps between the haves and the have-nots, and between young and older people. And then I've argued that the pandemic has highlighted the lack of insurance provided in the UK social security system. And it did, looking positive, it did lead to a greater debate about adequacy of benefits, although that hasn't actually yet shown up in concrete measures. I think obviously there are many people who are very disappointed the government didn't continue the £20 a week. But we did have much more discussion about the levels, or the adequacy of the levels of benefits than we have had in pre-pandemic times. Although, yeah, as I say, it's probably not yet clear that either the realisation of need more insurance nor the debate about lack of adequacy has yet affected the current government's approach to welfare. And then my last slide has a list of references, which I will make available to you somehow. But that's there too. So that's it, I think.
Thank you very much indeed. So, and great timekeeping as well. So we have plenty of time for questions. So we have people remote, and we have people in the room. If you want to ask a question and you're on the screen, can you use the raise hand function, please? And I will look out for those. And if you're in the room, can you use your raised hand function? Okay, so we have Tanya wants to come in.
Hi, yes. Thanks very much, Mike. That was really informative, and particularly some of the findings that are unexpected, which are very good to see. I was reflecting very much on your new findings on the implications for the wealth distribution. I think you did a very nice job of talking about the different aspects of financial wealth, and both in terms of pensions and housing wealth and liquid assets. But that sort of led me on to think about other forms of capital altogether beyond the financial, and what the impact of the pandemic had been on those. So we might also think about human capital and social capital, commonly talked about anyway. And of course, we know that in terms of human capital, the educational impact of the pandemic has been felt most by those who were already most disadvantaged, at least as far as the educational capital of the next generation is concerned. But also, of course, in terms of health, another key component of human capital, that those who are on the waiting list, who've got the untreated conditions, those who've got chronic conditions that haven't been treated and have been exacerbated by lack of treatment, during the course of the pandemic and long COVID itself. Again, all very unequally distributed across the population. So a pretty bleak outlook as far as the impact on the distribution of those other forms of capital is concerned. The one possible bright spot I thought was about what might have happened to the distribution of social capital. Of course, very difficult to measure. But we did see a real surge in expressions of social solidarity, especially early on in the pandemic. And it would be nice to think that there had been a growth in social capital in society as a whole, and perhaps not so badly distributed as the other forms of capital that we're talking about. So it's more of a comment or a reflection than a question, really. Thanks.
Thank you, Tanya. Do you want to respond to that reflection, Mike?
I think that yes, using capital considered broadly will be a great way into thinking about the inequalities of this crisis. And I totally agree with your assessment, Tanya. Yes. I mean, about how that might be distributed. Yes. I mean, we definitely know the educational capital, human capital, sorry, has been harmed in ways which are going to exacerbate future inequalities. And I think, as Tanya might remember, we hope to be looking at this with colleagues at the Centre for Economic Performance in the next year or so as part of our resolution managers work with them. And of course, Tanya's right on health capital.
Thank you. Yes. Right, so we've got a number of questions in the room now. We've got Eva, and then I think that's Juliet. Sorry, yes. So we'll take those two in turn.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I was just wondering if you have tried to replicate the analysis in terms of...
Can you stand up and speak very loudly?
Sure. Thank you very much. And I was wondering if you have tried to replicate the replacement rate exercise without assuming full take-up of benefits. And I was wondering if this, like, partial take-up of benefit would have skewed the distribution impact.
Gone from the very big picture comment to the very small scale comment. But it's a good question because we are going to be looking, again at, I'm writing a paper at the moment on lessons for the welfare state, and we are looking very seriously at this issue of insurance. The actual answer to your question was that we assumed full take-up when doing those calculations. If I had assumed incomplete take-up, I imagine that would have shown that would have lowered replacement rates in general. I'm not going to say anything about this about what is the skew because I'm not quite sure. But it's a good question, and we are thinking about it as we do future work and right now. And so if you are doing the same, then drop me an email.
Thank you. Eva.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for your presentation. I also wanted to come back to this issue of wealth. So you emphasized wealth inequalities, but I just thought it was very interesting to see that perhaps wealth has been increasing across much of the distribution, and whether that's also worth emphasizing and what that means, for example, for things like perceived economic insecurity. See? Another thing I thought of, you didn't show us what has happened to, for example, ethnic minority groups. So at the beginning of the crisis, they were really disproportionately affected by the pandemic. Have these effects also persisted until now? And just a very last quick thing about policy and thinking about these older workers. So you talked about social security, but should a policy response targeting that group come through social security or maybe other means like perhaps job training or other options? Thanks.
Thank you. I slightly missed your first question, Eva. You said that I'd shown wealth had gone up, but what was the implications of that on what?
On issues such as, for example, perceived economic insecurity or financial insecurity.
Okay. All right, fine. Okay. Three really tough ones there. I'm very aware I have left out, I don't have any discussion in this talk about the differential impact across ethnic minorities, and that is largely reflecting the lack of data in what I was deficiencies in data I was drawing on. So for a lot of my data, a lot of the data that tells us what's going on as quickly as possible in real time. We're using administrative data, so HMRC data on number of employees, which doesn't collect data on ethnicity. And then during the crisis, we commissioned quite a lot of surveys of our own, but even with sample sizes of 6,000 each go, it's not enough to identify. It's not enough to identify different ethnic minorities. But yes, you are of course right that the labour market impacts of the crisis have been felt more acutely by certain ethnic minorities than by white people. Yeah, so sorry, yes, that's definitely going on. And when you combine that with the health impacts, again, that's another reason why it's good to would be good to broaden my analysis to look also at educational and health inequalities. On the older workers and the policy implications, the policy implications are partly for the Department for Work and Pensions, or people who are. It is partly to remind them that there are some new claimants of job seekers allowance universal credit out there who the department might not be used to dealing with, and that older people, we know from evidence that older people respond or need different kinds of employment programs than do younger people, and that so therefore Job Centre Plus GWP should build that in, take that into account when they are designing the programs. It's also the other kind of policy response would be about giving all employees, say, the right to request flexible working, full stop, from day one. So to allow older workers, to make it easier for older workers to combine, to do part-time work or to work more flexibly, if one of the reasons for withdrawing is to do with health concerns. And then you asked about wealth. So what I'm showing of what's happened is that on average, we have saved more as a country. We have paid down our debts, and on average, that is definitely that's a good thing, and that is going to increase measures of financial resilience you were getting at. The worry comes only when you start to look at how that change has been distributed. But yeah, I mean, on average, the lack of spending in the pandemic has been a fantastic opportunity for households to pay down their debt, which they have done, and to save more, which they have done. But there's been a distributional slant to both of those. Does that get at your question?
Yes,
I can't. Okay. Hard to see the back of the room, so I can't.
We've got Mary Alice and Stephen, and I'm not sure which to get him first, but I'll go to Mary Alice first, go back to the screen, and then come to Stephen.
Hi, Mike. That was a really great overview. Thank you. I wanted to follow up on what you just said about debt and wealth, because I guess from reading a lot of the media and people who work in the kind of the area of consumer finance and welfare, there's always talk about debt and how debt has increased so much over the past year. Is that story just only people at the very bottom who don't even show up in the bottom percentile that you talked about, or is it perhaps types of debt that might not be covered in the data that you're looking at?
That's a really good question, because it's one we were also thinking about ourselves. I don't know the answer. I mean, we haven't actually been able to reconcile those two bits of data. I mean, it's definitely true that on aggregate, UK households are less in debt, less in arrears, have less on their credit card than they were when the pandemic started. That bit is definitely true. So how can we marry that with what debt advice charities are seeing? Well, I guess the answer is it's got to all be about the distribution. So it could be that more affluent households who, yes, had some debt, but were not in problem debt, but coping perfectly fine with it, have now paid it off. And it could be those people who've taken on more debt, and such people definitely exist, our surveys showing that. It may be those are the people who are much more likely to be now in problem debt. I mean, debt is not all bad, is it? Debt is only bad when it's a problem. So I suspect the answer to your question is that, and if you were hit by the pandemic, if you lost your job and you weren't furloughed, or you didn't get a self-employment grant, and you couldn't get a job through lockdown, that's going to, because it went on a long time, and the labour market was pumped up for most of 2020, you could easily end up with problem debt arising. And that's, so I think, yeah, I think we probably have seen more problem debt, because when the pandemic did hurt people, it hurt them for a long time, for a lot of money. But we've seen people who are not in problem debt easily pay off their, pay off their credit card balance, repay loans early, or not take out new loans because they're doing less spending. None of that is based on data. I can't point to a data set and say that's definitely what's going on. Although it'll be, it'll be in the Wealth and Assets Survey in a couple of years' time. But that is my attempt to reconcile the two. You look vaguely convinced, so we'll go with that. Thanks. Good, really good question.
So, Stephen, you want to come in now?
Hi, thanks for a great talk. Very useful overview. First comment is an observation that in your talk about the labour market, you focused on employment rather than self-employment. Have you got anything to say about self-employment? Maybe it's just following the rest, but that would be useful to know. The second one is more a general request for a general reflection about the role of data sources and different sorts of data sources for monitoring what's going on. We've got a shift to use of administrative data sources, so playing off timeliness against potentially fit for purpose, whether or not something's fit for purpose. And in this context, I reflect on, for example, things that you wrote about tracking what's really going on in the labour market using the HMRC PAY stats versus the labour force survey and so on and so on. And another, you guys have also run your own surveys, but I don't know the extent to which, if were we to go back and look using the official sources that are available now, they tell the same story. So I guess I'm inviting reflection on what you think the way is going forward about using these different sorts of information and trading off their advantages and disadvantages.
I mean, Stephen, that could be another talk in its own right. So I'm definitely not going to address all of that. I will say that the ONS have been really fantastic during this crisis, both in their speed at which they have brought in new data sets, the speed at which they turn to existing data sets, the speed at which they brought in new data sets, their ability, the fact that they are now writing a statistical release, so they're writing articles which show you how to reconcile different bits of information. So they've done a great job, and they of course are wrestling with all these challenges between timely administered data, between flash surveys where maybe you're not quite sure what the response rate is, so it's a bit bit dodgy, but it's quick, and then the kind of large scale household surveys which are slow, but then will have enough sample size to give you the ethnic minority breakdowns, for example. So I think I'm going to give you a non-answer to that, but there is much to be learned looking back at how data was used through this crisis. Different kinds of data have been used through this crisis. I mean, our approach has, well, we tended to look at them. We tended to focus on the administrative data because for the labour market, because it's the quickest. We're going to get the media headlines, so we need to know what's happening now. We commissioned several of our surveys with funding mostly from the Health Foundation, and we're very grateful, to try and get at some of the household context beneath that, and that's been really, really useful. But as I said, we have not been able to do it in large enough samples to get all the breakdowns you might have wanted to. I've forgotten what else you were asking about that, but you asked me the first question as well, didn't you? I didn't write down.
Self-employment. Self-employment,
yes. It's a tedious data story again. So what the labour force survey tells you about self-employment is that it's fallen massively, and maybe you've heard that in the headlines. It really, and I've written for a slide as you asked me the question, why does it? Well, maybe I will show it. You asked, it has gone down enormously. Does that show up? Probably, okay, so particularly for men, so this is just showing the change in numbers of people in work according to what sort of work they used to be doing. And if you look at men on the right hand side, the grey bars is the change in employment due to falling self-employment. So a total is given by the black dot, almost all the fall in male employment is due to self-employment. That's what the labour force survey tells you. Okay, women have also seen a fall in self-employment, but it's outweighed by the growth in regular employment. Unfortunately, the pandemic has occurred at the same time as the so-called IR35 changes, which is a tax change, which is clamping down on false self-employment. So that is definitely making some people who used to be self-employed, turning them into employees. That's happened. The second thing is that the job retention scheme was only available to employees and not to the self-employed, and that has either encouraged some people to turn themselves into employees, or has made them realize actually they were employees all along, but they just thought of themselves as being self-employed. So we think both of those classifications, we and the ONS, think that both of those have led to a reclassification of quite a lot of self-employed workers where there's been no change in the underlying economic activity. We have one extra piece of data that supports that evidence, which we're going to release next week. So the answer is I didn't talk about self-employment very much because I don't think we really know what's happening.
Thanks.
But it actually linked, yes, it was a good question because it does link into the question about data and data sources.
Yeah,
exactly. Sorry, but maybe that's why you were asking, yes. And the HMRC data I used quite a lot at the start of my talk was only for employees. Yeah. So I was leaving out the self-employed entirely then. And then I didn't focus it when we looked at the labour force survey because of this classification issue.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So I think we have, is it Grace Farrell there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Mike. Thank you for such an informative and insightful discussion. My question is, how do you think we're going to balance in the coming years redressing the economic impacts of COVID, say the debt increases among the people with lower incomes, even the slight increase in poverty rates, with preparing for future pandemics? With the recent climate crisis, obviously it's come into focus that in the next 6 years, we could have another pandemic. And especially in governments, where I'm from Northern Ireland, and Stormont has firstly an incredible amount of legislative and policy gridlock. Secondly, it's often ignored by Westminster in terms of social issues. And thirdly, it's legal, and actually half the country are taught a lot of anti-science rhetoric in school. That's our education policy. So yeah, how do you think our policy responses in the coming year can balance that redressing and preparing for the future?
Grace, you sound like you've written the sort of introduction to a major project the Resolution Foundation undertaking at the moment. It's the one along with the Centre for Economic Performance at the LSE, we are trying to think what sort of economic strategy the UK should have for the decade ahead, bearing in mind not just need to recover from COVID, but also cope with a new position outside the European Union and our required path to net zero, where the kind of USP for the project is that we've had a shock from leaving the European Union, which required the economy to restructure. We've had a shock from COVID, which will definitely lead to some permanent changes and has clearly affected government finances. And we need to also change our economy to decarbonize it. I have no answers, but the point of the project, which is going on for the next couple of years, is to try and come up with some of those. So it's the Economy 2030 project, and hopefully you'll hear a bit more about that in the next couple of years. Sorry, there was a question there too. I apologize. All I've done is plug my own future work.
Am I seeing any more hands? I had a question, Mike. I'm going to have to ask my own question now. It was about the geographical differences. So that the higher pay areas, the areas that have higher average pay have seen the bigger impacts on employment. And I just wondered, from what you then said about the hospitality, so I was thinking that this is not, this means that it's the implication is that it's the lower paid workers in the higher paid areas that are losing out. So there's no sense in which this is really an equalising move. Is that right? Was that the right interpretation? Is that what you're saying?
I didn't say that, but I should have done. Yes, that is the right interpretation. Yes, there have been some really detailed studies of this phenomenon in the US, where they using more data and more detailed data than we have access to in the UK. I've seen a few academics or think tanks attempt to do that, just to link not only to get the geographical spread, but to look within areas at the distributional consequences. And yes, it is basically what you say is basically true. Yes, the higher paid areas are suffering, but it's the lower paid people in the higher paid areas who are the ones who are out of work. And London's a bit weird because in London you have lower paid people commuting to serve higher paid people in slightly different areas. But in general, yes, you're right. Yes, it's the people who would have been working in hospitality and so on in Aberdeen who are suffering because the workers in Aberdeen are not going out as much.
They're getting larger within area inequality, and
possibly. That's a great research question.
Yes, the difference between yeah, okay.
That's a great research question.
Yes, I look forward to your answer to that then.
I'm looking to your department and your students too.
Exactly. Yes. Is there anybody else who wants to come in or follow up on any of the points that might raise as possible areas for discussion as well?
Yeah, I'll do it. So I'm reluctant to, hey, thanks, Mike. I'm reluctant to ask this question because it's not really fair, but and I'll ask it anyway. So obviously the title of the talk and the theme throughout is, the effect of the pandemic, the effect of COVID-19. Is there any way for you to get a sense of how much of what we see is attributable to the pandemic and how much of it is attributable to things that were to sort of a train that already left the station? I mean, you already talked a little bit about some changes in, I'm now forgetting what actually regulation it was, but I'm also, of course, thinking about Brexit. I mean, is there any way for us to kind of think of the counterfactual, like had other things not happened, how would have the pandemic affected the economy in the way that it has?
No, it's an absolutely fair challenge. I think one could write that research paper if one focused in on perhaps a subset of some of the domains I looked at, one of the domains I looked at, and some of the outcomes, but to do it comprehensively would I think, be impossible. I guess what I was trying to do in some of my talk was to point out where the trends we've seen in the last few years were different from or the same as previous trends. So, for example, what's happening to older women's labour market behaviour is completely different from the trend from the last 30 or 40 years. So older women have been working more and more and more, and they worked more and more and more even through the last 3 economic crises. And this one, they're working less. That's still not causal evidence that the COVID caused it, but it's a big clue, isn't it? And then in wealth, I mean, I think the reason we did the work looking at wealth is that it was so it's obviously not obviously. Wealth to income ratios have been rising in the UK for decades, and left to their own devices, wealth, most of that is through capital gains, and so most of that will naturally go to people who have some wealth. So sort of left to their own devices, the wealth distribution does just grow all the time. So these growing absolute gaps are probably not a surprise. If we'd done the same thing for previous years, we would have also shown growing absolute gaps. But we focused on that because it's very unusual in economic crises to see such large capital gains. So again, that was giving us a hint that a suggestion that what was going on there had something to do with the crisis, or was unique to the crisis. On the other hand, yes, you're absolutely right. Some other trends I touched on are long-standing ones. The decline of retail. People thought the decline of the high street was going on for years. COVID's just sped it up slightly or put a step change in it. The growth of online. We didn't talk about home working because I was saving my slides for next week, but probably what we're going to see is just a slight increase in the number of hybrid workers. Probably no change at all in remote working, and a slight increase in the number of hybrid workers. That had also been on an upward trend before the crisis. I imagine we'll end up back on that pre-crisis trend. But yes, no, good challenge to just keep on thinking, for us all to keep on thinking what would have happened anyway.
Thanks very much. Well, we're at after 15:15, so if there aren't any other burning questions, I'm not seeing any. Yes, so I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much, Mike. There was loads in there, huge amount to think about. Just to flag up next week, our next seminar is George Peluzzi, I think he's here, and is going to be talking about tracking systems. So come back and join us for that. And just to say once again, thank you very much.